So today, we are very honored to have Professor Klaus Kuselius. He will give us a talk with the exciting title, Hylomorphism and the Causal Role of the Soul in Aristotle. Before his lecture, I'd like to introduce him briefly, even if he has been well known to some of our audiences. So Professor Kuselius holds the chair of Asian philosophy at the University of Tübingen. He is also the editor of Hystomata, a journal for Asian philosophy and science. He received his PhD from the Humboldt University in Berlin and has previously held position at the University of Hamburg and the UC Berkeley. As one of the world leading scholars in Asian philosophy, especially Aristotle, he has published and edited several influential books, including a monograph on Aristotle's theory of animal motion, Streben und Bewegung. I'm sorry, I dropped the line. I'm off the line, perhaps. So he has published and edited several influential books, including a monograph on Aristotle's theory of animal motion, a reference book, Aristoteles Handbook, and the two new German translation of Aristotle's De Motu Animalium and De Anima. Since this year, I think he has been leading a new research project called The Text and the Idea of Aristotle's Science of Living Things, funded by the European Research Council. So this project is not only devoted to a new overall interpretation of Aristotle's philosophical mind, it also will produce a new critical edition of Aristotle's De Anima, both in print and digital. So please join me in welcoming Professor Kuselius.
Thank you so much. This has been a most generous introduction. It's very good to see you again, and the other ways. I am going to talk about hylomorphism and the causal role of the soul in Aristotle. And this really is a fundamental part of the project that you've been talking about in your kind introduction, namely a new overall interpretation of Aristotle's science of living things, and in particular, what he has to say about the phenomena of the mental, as we may call it. So the idea is to put hylomorphism into a certain perspective, into a methodological perspective, so as to clear the way to see what Aristotle actually has to say about the explanation of mental episodes and mental phenomena such as memory, perception, and so on, or animal locomotion. So that this talk that I'm going to give now is really giving you the basic methodological idea of that project. And obviously, this is work in progress, but the basic idea should, I hope, stand. So I am going to share the handout with you. And I hope that it has been circulated before, but if not, that doesn't matter very much. I will just go along the handout. That will be the structure of my talk. Okay, so if there are no further questions, I shall start now. Okay, so I start with a general characterization. I'm here at the very beginning of hylomorphism. Hylomorphism is Aristotle's metaphysical theory of the structure of things in nature, quite generally. And then I'm going to say something about psychological hylomorphism. Psychological hylomorphism is nothing but the application of general hylomorphism to a particular field of application, and that is the phenomena of the mental. and of living things quite generally. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I take to be a common conception in the minds of those who are understand themselves as hylomorphic interpreters of Aristotle's philosophy of mind, as they say. And I call this abstract psychological hylomorphism. And then I'm going to raise problems and questions for that view, which I think is not incorrect completely, but insufficient. Okay, and then I'm going to, from part 5 and 6 in my talk, I'm going to give you an alternative picture. I'm going to give you the basics of the alternative picture that I will propose as an alternative to abstract psychological hylomorphism. And then I draw a very short conclusion. So I'll start with general hylomorphism. As I said, general hylomorphism is the view, is a metaphysical view about the structure of things, about the metaphysical structure of all things in nature. And it can be characterized with the following set of 7 claims. I am going to read these claims out, and I think, or at least hope, that these claims are resulting in a view of general hylomorphism that is both adequate and uncontroversial. Now, that is very difficult, as you will know. In Aristotle scholarship, people disagree about the precise interpretation of hylomorphism, but I'm trying to stay clear of these controversial issues, and nevertheless, I'm trying to give you a picture that captures the things that are important, at least for my purposes here, about general hylomorphism. So, general hylomorphism is the view that all natural things are substances. Things in nature are substances, not properties, and so on. Properties are properties of the natural substances. And all natural substances, which I here call natural things, are metaphysically composed of a form and a matter aspect. That is why it's called hylomorphism. Hyle being the matter and morphe being the form. Now, the idea of this metaphysical component idea of form and matter that together make up the natural thing is such that form and matter are correlates. But the form is not just the shape or anything like that. It is more than that. It is the essence of the correlated matter. And that holds for all natural things, be it a tree or a stone or whatever. Now, form and matter are inseparable from each other. They are physically inseparable. And it's only the metaphysical analysis that can sort of isolate them. But even metaphysical analysis is not able to completely isolate them, as we will see. So form and matter are physically inseparable. I cannot take form of a rabbit and the matter of a rabbit and put it together, and then I have a physical rabbit. No, neither can I extract the form of the rabbit from the matter of the rabbit, of the physical rabbit, because then the rabbit will be dead. These components are metaphysical components that tell us something about the metaphysical structure of rabbits, but they're inseparable from each other in a physical way. And they relate to each other in some sort of identity, very flexible identity relation, namely as actuality and potentiality of the same thing. And this is why Aristotle says in a famous passage in the Metaphysics, and Metaphysics 8, chapter 6, that form and matter are somehow of the same thing, like, you know, of the living rabbit, for example, they are somehow one. And form and matter of natural things are not parts of natural things, because parts, they can be isolated from each other, and they propose the whole thing of which they are parts. And that is something that does not hold for form and matter, because matter is that which is given what it is by its form. So the form is the identity of the thing, and the identity of the thing is not a part of the thing. That's the simple reason why Mariological interpretations of Aristotle's hylomorphism, as they have been proposed in scholarship, are not adequate. They are not Aristotle's conception. And finally, here on point 7, the accounts of natural things may isolate the forms and their matter and vice versa, but only in account. But even in such cases, when I try to define the form of a natural thing, even then I will have to say this is the form of that particular kind of matter. So even if I'm trying to isolate in my metaphysical analysis form from matter, each of the correlates, the isolated correlates, will contain a reference to the other correlate. So whenever I say something about what is the form of any natural given thing, I will have to say that's the form of a certain kind of matter. And if I try to isolate the matter of a natural thing, I will have always to say that's the matter of a certain given form. And if I don't say that, I fail to capture what the thing that I'm analyzing actually is. So these are 7 claims that are characteristic for general hylomorphism, which is a general metaphysical theory about the structure, the metaphysical structure of natural things, quite generally. Now I move on to psychological hylomorphism. Psychological hylomorphism is just the very same set of claims applied to the domain of what people call psychology, but which really is Aristotle's science of living things. So for all living things, psychological hylomorphism says that all living things are hylomorphic compounds, just as any other natural thing. Okay. Now there is an exception to this, which is nous, the intellect. I'm not going to talk about this today. I'm going to restrict myself to talking about hylomorphic living things. And so we have the very same set of claims applied to the domain of living things. So we have 1 prime, all natural living things are unitary substances. 2 prime, all natural living things are metaphysically composed of a soul and a body aspect, soul being the form and body being the matter of the living thing. Soul is just another name for form in the domain of living things. And body is just another name for matter in the domain of living things. Soul is not body, but the essence of the living body. 4 prime, soul and body of natural things are physically inseparable correlates. 5 prime, soul and body of natural things relate to each other as actuality and potentiality. As such, they are somehow one. You know, my soul is the soul of my body, and my body is the body of my soul, and my soul is my essence. 6 prime, soul and body of natural things are not parts of natural living things, for the same reasons that I just listed above. My soul is my essence bestows the identity on me, what I am, and my identity is not my part. 7 prime, accounts of natural living things, just like any other hylomorphic account of natural things, may isolate souls from their bodies in account. But even in such cases, the isolated accounts of each correlate will contain a reference to the other correlate. So they are definitionally inseparable. So whenever I say adequately what the soul of a given living thing is, I will have to add that this is the soul of a given living thing with such a body and so on. Okay, they are definitionally inseparable from each other, even though you can go some long way in isolating the form from the matter. And this is indeed what Aristotle does in his De Anima, where he defines the soul. The whole project of the De Anima, Aristotle's work on the soul, is dedicated, or the whole project there is, let us define the soul. Okay? And then you see Aristotle defines the soul as the form of the living body. So the definition of the soul contains reference to the body. Okay, so that just is to remind you that psychological hylomorphism is but an application of a particular domain of general hylomorphism, namely living things. Okay, now Aristotle in his De Anima, in the place where he starts out with defining the soul, namely in the beginning of the second book, applies general hylomorphism to the special case of living things. And he says these four things here, A, B, C, D, which I think entail what I've just said about the application of general hylomorphism to the domain of living things. He says, the soul is a substance as the form of a natural body, which has life and potentiality. So this is to say, one is the essence, the other is the matter of the essence, and the one is actuality, the other is potentiality. B.
Laos, perhaps you should turn your page because
I think I did so.
It's problematic because we always see the first page of the screen you share.
And now is it better?
Yes, now it's better.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's something wrong with the whole with the full view. So I leave it at that. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm here.
Now
so the soul is the substance of the form of the natural body, which has life and potentiality. So form and matter are applied to body and soul, and the one is potentiality, the other is actuality. The soul is a substance according to the definition. It is the essence of a body, of a living kind. And the soul is the actuality. This is C and D. Hence, it is not necessary to investigate. This is a quote, or more or less a paraphrase of what Aristotle is saying there. Whether soul and body are one, just as it is not necessary to do so in the case of the wax and the imprinted shape, nor generally in the case of the matter of each thing, and that of which it is the matter. So they are somehow one. Right? So these are clearly, very clearly indications that Aristotle is just applying the general hylomorphic framework to the case of living things, and the soul plays the role of the essence and the form of the living thing. Now, two further claims follow from that. And these claims turned out to be very attractive to many modern interpreters of Aristotle. This is 8. The soul cannot be physically affected or moved except incidentally. So the soul is not a possible object of physical affection because it is not a thing. It is the essence of a thing. It is something that is of the living body, but it's not itself something that can be moved. Just like an abstract property, like for example, whiteness. Suppose my shirt is white, and if I walk from A to B, then the whiteness of my shirt, it will walk with me. But obviously, whiteness is not a possible subject for walking. So it is moving from A to B in an incidental way. Accidentally, it is true for the whiteness that qua being the whiteness of the white of my shirt, it moves from A to B when I move from A to B, but it itself could not work. It's not a possible subject of physical affection, and that holds also for the soul. And following from that, the soul is not a subject of mental episodes. So it's not true what Descartes says in his Meditations, that it is the soul that undergoes mental affections. It's the soul that perceives. It is the soul that is angry. It is the soul that is hungry, and so on. No, Aristotle thinks that is the soul-body compound that is the subject of these mental states. that's important because that right from the get-go excludes the idea of a homuncular conception of the soul. That is, there's a little thinking thing inside of me that sort of watches what's happening outside, and there's a little agent in me that bosses me around and tells me to go here and there, and it's like a little man, like a homunculus. Now that seems to be ruled out by the very conceptual framework of hylomorphism, into which Aristotle situates his analysis of the phenomena of the mental and the soul-body relation. Now that turned out to be very interesting in half a century ago, when people started to look at alternatives in the philosophy of mind between what they called scientific reductive physicalism, so the doctrine that the soul is not a real thing after all, or whatever you might call it or the mind, or whatever item is the preferred item of a given philosopher of mind. And on the other hand, Cartesian, as they called it, substance dualism. No, it's not true that given hylomorphism, it's not true to say that soul and body are two substances. No, they are two metaphysical aspects of one and the same substance, and that's the point. So that made Aristotle's hylomorphism a genuine alternative in a long-standing debate. And so Aristotle's hylomorphism inspired many philosophers to take him philosophically seriously and offer hylomorphic interpretations of Aristotle that sort of were compatible or congenial to the idea of a genuine alternative, at least on some level of abstraction, to these two extremes in the portfolio of the theories of the mind-body relation. Now, just to say that about Aristotle's hylomorphism, what I just said is true, I think, but it is incomplete. And what I call abstract psychological hylomorphism is basically the view that what I've just said by way of characterizing Aristotle's psychological hylomorphism is true, and that also is his theory of the soul. Okay, and that view I call abstract psychological hylomorphism. That's the thesis that the soul is the essential form of the living body along the lines of psychological hylomorphism is just explicated. And that this, i.e. the form-matter analysis of soul and body, plus the definition of the soul as a set of capacities in the following chapters of the De Anima, is the whole story. Psychological hylomorphism is Aristotle's theory of the soul. So that's the view of what I call abstract psychological hylomorphism. And that, as I just said, that was attractive to many hylomorphic and philosophically ambitious interpreters. It promises to offer a non-reductive materialist account of the soul that avoids the pitfalls that are typical of the post-Cartesian situation in the philosophy of mind. And it does so by conceiving of the soul as not separate as a substance, but as something of the living body, which is what Aristotle says. It takes the soul seriously, so it's a non-reductive. It does accept that there are things like souls, but they are not materially extended. They conceive of the soul as immovable and as not a subject of mental episodes. Okay, that was interesting because, as I just said, it promises a route to the solution of the difficulties of post-Cartesian philosophy of mind, and it does so in a very elegant way, namely by assimilating the relation between soul and body to the relation between the physical and the conceptual. So this move can be interpreted as steering a middle course between reductive materialism and Cartesian substance dualism. And famously, Jonathan Barnes has an article which he wrote, I think, in the beginning 70s, where he was saying that there's the Charybdis or the Scylla of reductive materialism on the one hand, and the Charybdis of Cartesian substance dualism, and Aristotle seems to have the look of an Odysseus. So he's steering a middle course, and that's very attractive. Now, in what follows, and I hope to have been giving you an account of Aristotle's hylomorphism, that psychological hylomorphism that stays clear of the most controversial questions. What I'm now doing in this section is I will give you a list of questions that are really problems for the view as canvassed, namely abstract psychological hylomorphism. And that is basically the idea that the soul is something that is causally efficacious in nature. And it is localized in a particular place in the body and so on. And these observations that are all well attested in Aristotle's text, they pose a problem for the conception of abstract psychological hylomorphism as canvassed. So Aristotle says in text 1 here that the soul is a subject of affection. He says the soul is affected in a certain way. Second, in perception. He also says that the soul is spatially contiguous with incoming perceptual stimuli. This is text 2, text from the physics. But there are parallels also in the De Anima. This is a passage where Aristotle says there is nothing intermediate between the agent and the patient of change. And that's very important for him because in Aristotle's physics, interaction or any action can only happen between the agent and the patient of any causal relation if there is contact between the agent and the patient. Without contact, there is no interaction. So nulla actio per distans. Nothing happens causally by way of distance. And then he says that even the senses undergo alteration, since sense perception is a motion through the body, in the course of which the sense is affected in a certain kind of way. And that seems to say both of these things, that that the soul is affected, and B, that there is contiguity, there is contact between the senses and incoming sensory motions, that is stimuli. Now, it gets worse for abstract hylomorphism. In text 3, Aristotle says that the hylomorphic soul is distinct from the body and localized in it in a particular region. So I quote here text 3, there must be something that moves them both, that is both halves of the body, and this is the soul, which is distinct from a special magnitude of this kind, though it is in it. So the soul here in this passage is said to be not materially extended, but localized in a particular region of the body. But it gets still worse, and this is text 4. Aristotle says that the soul moves the body by way of some leverage mechanism. Okay? It exercises its self-moving or its moving function by way of leverage. Now that seems to be hard to reconcile with abstract psychological hylomorphism, because all these passages, each in their own way, assign a causal, in some way physical, role to the soul on the level of mental episodes. But how is a causal role of the hylomorphic soul even possible on abstract hylomorphic psychology. A causal role on the level of episodes seems very difficult to reconcile with the abstract hylomorphic conception of the soul. If the soul is or is similar to the concept of life, or perhaps the concept of the living body insofar as it is alive, as abstract psychological hylomorphism claims it is, it seems that the soul can relate to its body not via causal, but only via conceptual or logical relations. Hence, talk of the hylomorphic literature as the realization, the soul as the realization, the body as the realization of the soul. So this is a way of further conceptualizing, making sense of the idea that the body pertains to the physical and the soul pertains to the realm of the conceptuals. And then, how can these two relate? Oh, they do not relate via causal relations, because the one is the concept of the other. Right? But that seems to make non-conceptual relations between soul and body impossible. And a physical relation of causal, efficient causality, that is not a conceptual relation, that's a physical relation. And just an example here, Martha Nussbaum openly speaks of two logoi, two accounts. One is a teleological one that states reason, so this is about human action, and the other is separate from that, and that gives you the bodily sort of necessary conditions for that, and that is supposed to be the realization of the teleological account. So there are two accounts, and they do not interact. One, they interact by metaphysical fiat, because the one is supposed to be the realization of the other. But I am not aware of passages where Aristotle accepts the framework of realization. And, I guess the idea is universal and the realization of the universal. So conceptual versus physical. And Aristotle doesn't talk in this way about the body-soul relation, but Martha Nussbaum does. And she does so because she is a hylomorphic, an abstract hylomorphic interpreter of Aristotle's philosophy of mind. But I think there is also what I call a very general problem for all abstract psychological hylomorphic interpretation of Aristotle. And this is that this I think really shows that this is that the vice of that interpretation is that it is too abstract. Because there is no particular solution for any particular problems of the philosophy of mind on the level of episodes that is distinctively hylomorphic. Aristotle's interpreters cannot agree even on fundamentals of Aristotle's take on the explanation of mental episodes. Abstract hylomorphism, instead of offering solutions for the problems of the philosophy of mind, merely formulates general constraints for such solutions. Well, it has the look of a second-order theory. So something like a generic position in the post-Cartesian landscape where you compare types of theory of the mind, but you are not actually going about explaining the phenomena of the mental. So think of the debate that, between literalists and spiritualists in the theory of perception. They disagree on fundamental issues about how to explain perception, and even on what perception is, essentially for Aristotle. So how is that possible? Both of them claim to be interpreters of Aristotle's hylomorphism. Think of the debate around desire. Is desire presupposing some intentional state that represents some object of desire in some particular kind of way, or is it not? And so on and so forth. People disagree about virtually all particular explanations that Aristotle has to offer about the philosophy of mind. And they do so in spite of the fact that they all claim to be hylomorphic interpreters. So that is something that I think shows that something is wrong with abstract psychological hylomorphism as an approach to Aristotle's philosophy of mind, or to be more precise, his explanation of the phenomena of the mental. And that vice is, that shortcoming is, it's too abstract. It just doesn't give us anything, no particular explanation. It just tells us, oh, something very great is happening, and this is avoided, and that is avoided. And that sounds great, doesn't it? But we are not told what is actually going on in when it comes to explaining mental phenomena. And what I'm going to do now is that I'm going to propose an alternative picture. And I do not write this in the handout, but my general approach to Aristotle is this. Aristotle thinks of himself, and he says so many times, as a successful philosopher who has given a resolution to the problems of philosophy as he saw them. He nowhere indicates that he thinks that the problems of the philosophy of the mental are eternal riddles to be thought about. He thought of himself as having given a resolution to them. And if we take this seriously, then abstract psychological hylomorphism is not satisfactory. Okay, so just to remind you, these three claims of abstract psychological hylomorphism are the main claims that identify that theory. And this is, just to remind you, the soul is the essential form of the living body, according to the set of claims I presented to you. B, the body pertains to the physical and the soul to the conceptual domain. C, the propositions A and B that I just gave tell us a complete story about the soul. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to propose to accept A, namely hylomorphism, psychological hylomorphism, but I reject B and C. And in order to do so, I will walk you through a number of passages. So I start with the very motivation of hylomorphism in Aristotle's De Anima. My thesis is that the so-called commonest definition of the soul in De Anima 2.1 ranges on a level of abstraction that is much higher than assumed by abstract psychological hylomorphism. I claim that Aristotle's psychological hylomorphism, abstract psychological hylomorphism, is not Aristotle's theory of the soul, but a methodological reflection on what the soul and its explanatory role in the science of living things consists in. The commonest definition gives us a job description of the hylomorphic soul. It thereby establishes criteria for any hylomorphic theory of the soul, not just Aristotle's. It tells us what sort of thing the soul has to be in order to be functional within an explanatory science of living things. Aristotle's own theory of the soul, as it applies to episodes of mental events, will become apparent only in the course of his actual explanations of the phenomena of living things, as given in the De Anima, the Papa Naturalia, and the De Motu Animalia, and other writings, like, for example, on the generation of animals. Now, here is how Aristotle introduces his discussion of previous theories of the soul. Basically, what he says is, this is what people thought who thought about the soul before me. This is T5. Now, that which has soul is held to differ from the inanimate, especially in two respects, namely motion and cognition. And these, roughly speaking, are also the two characteristics we inherited from our predecessors about the soul. So you see that there's a move from empsychon to psyche, from what is endowed with the soul to the soul. So the predecessors, he says, attempted to explain the phenomena of living things by attributing features of living things to the soul, with one exception, namely the harmonia theory, and I cannot go into it here. Thus, they conceived of the soul either as consisting of the elements of the things, material elements of the things, so as to be capable of cognizing everything, and they did this via the like is known by like principle of cognition, or as the most mobile thing, so as to explain self-motion, or both. Now, the criticism that follows in Aristotle's first book of the De Anima aims at refuting these theories. He refutes them on different accounts. He says that they don't make sense, and he says that they don't apply to the phenomena. And he concludes his criticism with T6. From what has been said, he says, it's evident that it is not because the soul is compounded of the elements that cognition belongs to it, nor is it true to say that the soul is moved. So here is the methodological morals of the criticism, as I conceive of it. Aristotle concludes his criticism of the predecessors with a claim that the previous theories of the soul failed to account for the main relevant phenomena with genuinely explanatory causes. Cognition cannot be explained by making the soul consist of the elements of things. That doesn't give you an explanation. Neither can movement be explained by making the soul a moved thing. It's just another moved thing. It doesn't explain motion. So the predecessors, by postulating new entities that more or less behave like ensouled things, instead of explaining the phenomena, in effect only added to the number of explananda, the things to be explained. But an explanation of the phenomena of living things is exactly what Aristotle aims at when he engages in his inquiry into the soul. This is what he says in the very beginning. And the following chapter, De Anima 2.1, I think, is really a reaction to that state of affairs at the end of this criticism of the predecessors. The chapter engages in a methodological reflection on what it is to be a genuinely explanatory cause of the phenomena of life. So you see, it's on a very high level of abstraction. Thus, the most common definition of the soul explicates the explanatory role. That is what it means for the soul, or for any theory of the soul, to be explanatory as a cause of the phenomena of living things. And that just is to be the substance, essence, according to the account. So the Anima 2.1 is a methodological characterization of the explanatory role of the soul within Aristotle's general hylomorphic philosophy of nature. I do add, however, that this is not yet Aristotle's theory of the soul. Aristotle's theory of the soul is a theory of the item that plays that role canvassed in the Anima 2.1. Okay, now I'm going to say something about Aristotle's theory of the soul. If I am roughly on the right track, then it would be nice if I could show two things. Namely, first, that Aristotle at least thinks that he has a theory of the soul, which is explanatory of the phenomena of life on the level of episodes. And B, his theory of the soul complies with abstract standards of psychological hylomorphism along the lines of the set of claims that I introduced at the beginning of my talk. Okay, and here is how I plan to do it. Fundamental, I think, is to see that Aristotle's definition of the soul, as it is called in the De Anima, defines the soul as a set of capacities of the living body: the vegetative capacity, perceptual capacity, and the thinking capacity. That, however, doesn't mean that the soul is just a capacity. Actually, it is defined as an actuality. And I think the actuality of the soul is key to understanding the causal efficacy of the soul on the level of episodes. So, first point, on the basis of the evidence from Physics 8, 6, and other such-like passages, and there are many of them, I interpret Aristotle's repeated claims that the soul of the animal exists or comes into being in the body as claiming not only that the living animal body is ensouled, but also that the soul comes into episodic existence. So there's an actuality of the soul, and that is a physical reality. I will tell you in which way. Second, I interpret that episodic existence of the soul, not as the existence of the soul as the animal's capacity of perception, and now I'm going to talk about perception only, because the capacity exists throughout an animal's life anyway, but as the actuality of the soul, as the resulting achievement of the processes that are distinctive for the living animal body. So the living animal body is a body that is subservient, teleologically subordinated to bringing about its essence. The essence is the soul, and the soul is defined by the capacity of perception. So actual perception is the achievement of the body. And actual perception brings something with it that can make a physical difference. Now, this is point 3. The distinctive achievement of the animal's vital processes as an animal, because animals are defined as perceivers by Aristotle, is the actual presence of the matterless perceptual form in the organism. Okay, so Aristotle defines the perception as the capacity of the living body to take on, to receive perceptual forms without their matter. Those forms are qualities. Now note, Aristotle has a qualitative physics. He thinks that qualities like colors and sounds and so on are actual properties of physical things. They are respectable even if material not extended entities of nature, and they are causally efficacious. The capacity of perception is the capacity to take on qualities of external objects without their matter, that is, without the objects. And therefore, they are the actual presence of a quality, or the soul is causally involved in the presence of that quality. And that is sufficient to make the soul do causal work, because Aristotle has a qualitative physics. That's very important. And that explains that for him, we do not have to have 2 levels of explanation. No, that's not correct. The soul, the perceptual soul, if actual, does make a causal difference in the world, and it does so by way of being involved in the production of internally present qualities. And these qualities can have an impact on the body. Now, 4. To the extent in which the episodic existence of the actualized perceptual soul is involved in the production of the matterless form in the organism, the actuality of the perceptual soul can do causal work on the level of mental episodes. Okay, now I'm going to go very briefly through the difficult problems for abstract psychological hylomorphism on the basis of the 4 claims that I just made. So being a subject of affection, being contiguous with the incoming bodily affections, being distinct from but localized in a particular region of the body, and being the mover of the body as a fulcrum, okay, by some sort of leverage mechanism. And I argue for the following. Aristotle does not think that the soul is a subject of affection in any kind of way. So when he says soul in the passages that I quoted, he doesn't mean it. He says, and there's a passage in which he clarifies that, but I'm going to tell you how. But he does accept B, that the soul is contiguous with the incoming bodily affections, and that it is, and C, and D. Okay, and I think that B and C, namely the localization of the soul in a particular region of the body, namely the heart, and the fact that the soul is contiguous with the body, those are constitutive parts of Aristotle's theory of the soul, that is, the theory of the item that fulfills the criteria of any hylomorphic theory of the soul that are established in the Anima 2.1. So let me start with text 7, which says that the soul is, so that gives us the general picture, the soul as a localized entity in the body. Aristotle says that the soul is located in the heart as the center of the animal body, but that it is at the same time distinct from the body. It is the terminus, that is the point of arrival of incoming sensory stimuli. That is just what Aristotle assumes. He says the soul is located, and from that it follows, given its function and the way that the animal body is construed, that it is the terminus, the point at which the incoming sensory stimuli, as it were, stop and are discriminated. And when a sensory stimulus reaches the soul, the perceptual soul is actualized and perception takes place. The resulting perceptual qualities then might or might not issue in motor reactions in an outgoing direction, which in turn may or may not result in the locomotion of the animal as a whole. This makes the soul the starting point of motor reactions. Okay? So the soul is the terminus of incoming motions and the starting point of outgoing motions. And text 7 says so, and this can be illustrated with a diagram here. Now, for our purposes, you wouldn't even need this one. You could have a simpler one with A, B, C. The important thing is that there are incoming motions coming from B to A. A is the center of the animal, that's the heart, or the analogous part of the body, and there is the soul located, and it discriminates the incoming sensory stimuli. And then that's its function as the terminus as incoming motions, and then it is also the starting point, namely the qualities that are there in the act of discrimination isolated. They have an impact on the body because the body is such as to react to these perceptions by way of heatings and chillings, and the directing principle here is self-preservation. So the body reacts in self-preserving ways to the incoming sensory affections, and that results in motions going from A to C. So that's the basic picture. Okay, I think that if we take this picture on board, and that picture is to be found in the De Anima, and it's found to be found outside of the Anima, so it's well attested. On that basis, we can see how the localization of the soul in a particular region of the body is a constitutive part of Aristotle's theory. Aristotle thinks about the body-soul relation, at least in part, in topological terms. So there's a certain place, not in the Aristotelian sense, but there's a certain place where the soul is located, and that is very important because that makes it possible for the soul to do causal work. B, the contiguity of the soul with incoming sensory affections, and hence with the body, seems to follow from C, that is from its localization. However, B, for Aristotle, also forms the basis for the possibility of the causal efficacy of the soul. Aristotle is committed to the thesis that there is no actio per distans, as I already said. Thus, in order for the soul to have efficient causality, it is required that there be nothing between the soul and the body it acts upon. Hence, there is contact between the soul and the body, even if not vice versa. It's a special story that Aristotle has an account for, and I cannot go into here. So he does not think that in the case of the soul, contact is reciprocal. A has contact with B, body, with soul, but not B with A. Therefore, the soul does not have contact with the body. And he explains that elsewhere. Now, this is, I think, the basis on which Aristotle develops his accounts of mental episodes. And so let me just go through them very briefly. Aristotle does not say A, that is, that the soul is a subject of mental episodes. Indeed, he says that in a way, the senses undergo alteration, but really they do not undergo alteration. And I think the place where he makes this very clear is T8. He says one should not say that the soul pities, learns, or thinks, but rather that it is the hylomorphic compound, that is the man, as he says, with the soul. This does not imply that motion is in the soul, but rather that sometimes it proceeds to the soul. Oh, the soul is the terminus. And sometimes it starts from it as a starting point. So here Aristotle is quite clear that the soul is the center of incoming motions and causally responsible for perception and motor processes, but it does remain unaffected throughout. So I reject A. So D, the thesis that the soul moves the body as a fulcrum, is explained in the De Anima and in the De Motu Animalium. And Aristotle's theory of animal locomotion in the De Motu Animalium is explicitly presented as the answer to the question of how the soul moves the body. The soul moves the body. So the soul is causally efficacious. And the answer to the problem, to the question, is that the soul is the mover as the animal in virtue of being involved in the production of some presentation, perception, or mental representation of an object of desire. So this is T10. The first mover of them is the object of desire. That is, if you take a rabbit, you know, the carrot that the rabbit sees. For it imparts motion without being moved. But it's not the carrot as such that moves. It is the mental representation of the carrot by being apprehended by thought or fantasia. And that involves the soul. And that is how the soul is the first move. So what sets the animal into motion is the actuality of the cognizing soul. It moves the animal as a fulcrum because the soul, being involved only in the production of a matterless perceptual qualitative form, and as I have said, qualities are respectable and causally efficacious items of Aristotle's physics, the soul remains unmoved throughout the entire process. And how then does the cognizing soul impart motion to desire? Aristotle defines desire as a teleologically guided natural motion in the animal in reaction to the perception of things that are good or bad for the animal. Desire pursues what is good and avoids what is bad for it. Aristotle identifies desire with qualitative changes, that is, thermic changes, heatings and shiftings, and they are caused by perception. Okay, so this is one of the many passages where this is said, is T11. So we say that the faculty of sense perception is there too, that is in the middle of the body, so that when, because of sense perception, the place around the origin is altered and changes, the adjacent parts change also, expanding and contracting, so that on account of these, animal motion necessarily comes about. So the soul, whose actuality involves the actual presence of a matterless perceptual quality in the organism, can be causally efficacious as some kind of fulcrum by causing thermic alterations of desire, while it itself remains unmoved. Now comes Aristotle's account of sense perception, which I think is also to be explained with reference to what I called Aristotle's theory of the soul, namely the theory of the item that fulfills the criteria established in the Anima 2.1, i.e. localization in the heart and contiguity with incoming and outcoming motions. I will not go into the details here for lack of time, but you can see this if you read the handout. But basically, the idea is Aristotle is a realist about physical qualities. Qualities are carried by incoming sensory stimuli. They are discriminated in the following way. Qualities are defined as certain proportions of extremes of qualitative scales. For example, to be read is some proportion between light and dark, and the eye is, as it were, tuned according to the neutral state between light and dark, and that gives us a neutral value, and an incoming value of red will reach the center, the discriminative center of the animal. And what happens there is that the incoming value and the value according to which the sense of sight is, as it were, tuned, they will be juxtaposed. And the juxtaposition of two values on qualitative scales just is to be a quality, because qualities are nothing but proportions of extreme values on scales. So there will be the quality red, that is the contrast between the neutral value and the incoming red value, apparent in the perceiver. And that is the quality that is going to be manifest in the perceiver. And that's the quality. And so it can do causal work in the way in which I just said. So this explains the process of sensory discrimination as a process in which a perceptual form, a quality, is produced in the organism via the juxtaposition of minimally two perceptual values. The juxtaposition is but the contiguity between the incoming sensory stimuli and the locus of the soul, which is tuned, as it were, is a certain quality itself, namely a neutral quality. And that happens, that is the contiguity, the juxtaposition of the incoming and the contrasting middle value happens exactly at the point where the incoming sensory stimulus reaches the endpoint of its inward motion towards the perceptual center of the animal, which is located in the heart. And before it passes that point, and perhaps reverses back into a different region of the body. At the point at which the motion literally stops moving in that direction to the center, the perceptual soul's neutral value is actualized, and we have the contrast and hence the quality present in the perceiver. Now, that is the picture that I think is Aristotle's, the basic features of Aristotle's theory of the soul, understood as a theory of the item that fulfills the criteria that hold of any hylomorphic explanation of the soul, or theory of the soul, as they are established in the Anima 2.1. Now, the question that I need to ask now is this a hylomorphic theory, or is this something else? I mean, obviously, what I presented to you, the localization of the soul, the qualitative nature of the work that the soul does, the contiguity, the fulcrum mechanism, and all of that, this really sounds quite crude. And maybe you think it's philosophically unattractive because it is hopelessly outdated. But don't forget, Aristotle is an ancient philosopher. Now, the question then is, in spite of whatever you might think about how plausible or these accounts, this theory of the soul of Aristotle is this hylomorphic, yes or no? That's the question that I am going to address now. And these are just the points that I raised in characterizing the hylomorphic theory of the soul on an abstract level. And my conclusion is that Aristotle thinks that Aristotle's theory of the soul as canvassed now fulfills these criteria. So 1 and 5 prime, that is, let me see, that is, yeah, there we go. So 1 prime is all natural living things are unitary substances, and 5 prime says that soul and body relate as actuality and potentiality, and they are somehow one. They don't seem to pose any problem because Aristotle's notion of sameness of body and soul seems flexible enough to accommodate the local distinctness of the actuality of the occurrence of the living body's actual vital functions, namely in the heart. This is the place where, according to Aristotle, cognition takes place. He thought of the brain as some sort of air condition. Still, body and soul are essentially one in that the soul is located in the body, and that it is the essence of the body, and that the actuality of the soul is the result and the achievement of the body's processes insofar as it is alive as an animal. Similarly, 2, 3, and 4. All natural living things are metaphysically composed of soul and body aspects. Soul and body of natural living things are physically inseparable correlates. And soul is not body, but the essence of the living body. If the Anima 2.1 is a job description of whatever item is going to play the role of the explanans of life, and not Aristotle's canonical definition of that item, and that is my claim, then there is no obstacle for the perceptual soul to play the role of the form of the living body. The perceptual soul can do this as the perceptual mean, the aestheticae mesotes, in the sense of the proportion of perceptual values according to which the animal's perceptual system is, as it were, tuned, as I said, in order to be capable of engaging in episodes of perception. And since perception is what defines animals, the perceptual soul functions also as the essence of the animal body. Physical inseparability is secured by the fact that each would lose either its identity or its existence without the other. And since 4 prime is the case, definitional inseparability, that is 7 prime, holds as well. 6 prime, the claim that soul and body are not physical parts of things, is not a problem because the soul's distinct location and actuality with relation to the body does not make the perceptual soul a physical part, of the hylomorphic compound. Physical parts are quantitatively distinct parts, and the soul is not distinct from the body in quantity. Finally, the perceptual soul is not physically affected or a subject of mental episodes when actually present in the body, since its actuality consists in a matterless proportion, that is, the presence of a quality perceived, which is not a possible subject of affection. A quality is not a possible subject of affection because it is not a subject at all. It is a quality. It can appear or disappear, but it is not itself a subject. Subjects are only hylomorphic compounds. Rather, the subject of phenomenal experience is the living body, the man that receives the perceptual form and makes perceptual experience due to the actuality of its soul. So I have to conclude that Aristotle's theory of the soul as canvassed here is hylomorphic. So let me just very briefly conclude. Independently of what we might think about the inadequacy of Aristotle's physics, or perhaps even about the crudeness of his accounts of mental episodes as presented here, he is an ancient philosopher after all. I hope to have shown four things. First, abstract psychological hylomorphism is insufficient for the explanation of mental episodes, and it is not identical with Aristotle's theory of the soul. Second, it is possible to identify a theory of the soul in Aristotle's works, which is both hylomorphic and explanatory of mental episodes, including episodes of perception. Three, it is possible to do so in a way that avoids attributing conflicting views to Aristotle, and in a way, fourth, that puts cardiocentrism at the center of the explanatory power of the theory, while it avoids a homuncular view of the soul. Thank you very much for your patience.
Okay, thanks, Klaus. Thanks for your exciting talk. So now let's move to the Q&A section. I think we have about 45 minutes. And the audience can either use the raise hand option to tell us that you want to talk, and we will open the mic for you according to the order. Or you can leave questions on the message board, and Klaus can select the question you want to answer. So now I think the floor is open. I don't know who is the first one, but let me, Liu Wei, perhaps I give you the
Thank you very much, Klaus. Thanks again for this wonderful talk. It's very lovely. I don't have many questions concerning the concrete parts of your talk. I think you're all correct, but I do have a couple of questions on the general strategy of your paper. So at one time, it seems that you are saying that the abstract psychological hylomorphism is just too abstract. We just need to make it more concrete. So we go to all the details you later elaborate. At another time, it seems that you're arguing against this abstract psychological hylomorphism, especially on page 4 of your handout when you list ABC and saying that you are going to argue against B and C. But I don't quite understand why B creeps in, because the body pertains to the physical and the soul to the conceptual domain. It seems this statement just go against 9 crown, as you listed as part of the abstract psychological hylomorphism. So I would like to hear your clarification on that. So what's your general...
if you permit, I'll answer to this right away.
Sure, go ahead, please. Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for this. I might have overdone with my with my endorsement. When I say I do take abstract psychological hylomorphism on board, I have to qualify that in the way in which I do on page 4, I think, namely that I do not take on board the description that I gave it. I mean, hylomorphic interpreters don't say so. They don't say that they think that the soul is something on the level of the conceptual, whereas indeed, that's a big question. Many would even deny that, because Aristotle talks about my soul and your soul, and that doesn't seem to be a universal. And so there's this huge question involved about the universality, the status of universals in particulars and so on, and the question whether there are individual forms or souls. And that is just a description. And when I say that I buy into abstract psychological hylomorphism as on the adequate level of abstraction, I do not mean to buy buy as well this description of it, but just the point that the soul is, according to claims 1 to 7. And thank you. I will need to clarify that, because otherwise I both endorse and reject the theory. And that I don't want to say that. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much for the.
But that's important. But that's important because that's a particular. I want to take it on board on a certain level of abstraction, and that's really the main thing that I want to bring across regarding abstract hylomorphism. So if I say something in the abstract, that doesn't make it false. It just is not the whole story.
Okay. Thank you very much. And the second question is concerning your again, general, your attitude toward the commonist definition of the soul. It seems that a part of the abstract psychological hylomorphism are actually coming from the definition, but you would like to exclude the definition from the theory of the soul, but just claiming it's just methodological comments. I think that's also a little odd to me. Why not just say that the definition is just part of the theory, but just on the very broad or general level of it?
That's a good point as well. So Aristotle has it sometimes, for example, in his metaphysics, that he establishes criteria for theories. That seems to be very important for him. And in virtue of the fact that these criteria are fulfilled by a particular theory, all these methodological criteria are trivially, so they hold of the theory. So the point is, yes, it is a part of Aristotle's theory of the item soul, that is this cardiocentric theory, that it is the essence of the body and so on. But the account, the most general definition of the soul, as it is called, that is compatible with many different theories. Okay, you could have another theory of the hylomorphic soul. Maybe that would be not the most adequate one, I don't know. But there is no commitment to any particular theory of the item. And that is the point that I want to bring across. I mean, you're right, and again, importantly so, that obviously all these, that is a little too thin, perhaps, to say, oh, these are just methodological points. And methodologically, it's tremendously important, but they are actually points of, bits of the meat of the theory, as we would say.
Right. But not the full meat.
But so that's right. I want to agree with that. But on the other hand, if I'm correct that this, in principle, there could be a plurality of theories that fulfill these criteria, I need to drive a wedge between these two, and I think I am entitled to do so. And maybe I should be looking for a different term, not methodological. I mean, so the point is, this is just here it is. Here it is. It's not just methodological. What I actually, and I don't even say so. I say that it is a general methodological characterization for any hylomorphic theory of the soul. And with a hylomorphism, you get the content bit of it. So I think that is my considered answer to your question. But thanks very much. I need to point this out more clearly. Very, very good questions, Wei. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. Perhaps can I use my privilege to have a follow-up question? A very short one.
You would have to give yourself permission to do so.
Yeah, in the same passage, because I think your interpretation presupposes Aristotle is liberal enough to have a plurality, different form of the hylomorphic theories, or different kinds of hylomorphic theory of soul. But whether we have, any textual evidence for this possibility, because my intuition is that Aristotle thinks hylomorphism is correct, is his own theory. He has only the theory of hylomorphism. So I think, of course, it's theoretically possible we have different form of hylomorphism, but in Aristotle's work, how could we make it possible?
Yes, I think that's, again, thank you very much. That's a very good point. And I think I share the intuition that is behind your question, and that is the idea that, well, come on, Aristotle thinks of himself as having, basically offered resolutions to the riddles of philosophy, basically all that there are, and he shows himself to be convinced that his theory is the only one that actually works. So why should he even engage in the possibility, especially since he doesn't even mention them, of there being a whole variety of, many hylomorphic theories of the soul? So that's the intuition, and I can, yeah, that sounds to me, sounds kind of right. The point is, it's not important for my view that in which way you reconstruct the relation between what I call general or abstract hylomorphism, abstract psychological hylomorphism and Aristotle's theory of the soul, whether you construct it in such a way that there are actually many theories. The point is, hylomorphic theories of the soul, the point is that it's not yet a determined theory. So Aristotle, another way of describing what Aristotle is doing is the familiar way from his ethics, that you start with the contours, and then you sort of start drawing out the picture. And then what the anima 2-1 would be doing is it would draw the contours. It would give a hypographie, okay? And the result would be the same. What is important for me is not the conceptualization of that there are actually many theories, but it's not yet clear what the theory is. By saying what he says in the Anima 2-1 following, he is not yet giving us an explanatory account of the phenomena of the mental. And Aristotle thinks that I can only know really what an essence of a given thing is, given his theory of science, when I see what the essence actually explains. So it's not enough just to say, oh, it is the explanatory essence. You really have to go into the nitty-gritty details to see what the soul is or any other essence is. And that's the point that I want to bring across. Now, there's a parallel in metaphysics that has been discovered by Alan Code, who speaks of general essentialism on the one hand, and Aristotle's theory of substance on the other. So if we, in the metaphysics, which is very, very methodologically self-reflexive, he asks, what kind of theory do we need, and so on. And then there are constraints on what Alan calls general essentialism. And then there's a theory, maybe his theory of substance, that is actually the best possible instance of that. But it is an instance. And I would maintain that. I don't know whether I'm really addressing your question, but I hope so.
Yes, thanks. It's helped. Okay, I think next one, Li Wenqi, and then Zheng Zhonghua, Wang Wei, Liu Zhe. So first, Li Wenqi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Cosilius. And actually, I learned a lot from your talk, and I have two questions. One is about the hylomorphism, and the other is about your interpretation of Aristotle's theory of soul. So my first question, so is that in the claim 7 of hylomorphism, you said the isolated accounts of each correlate will contain reference to the other correlate. So my understanding is, taking the form and matter as an example, the account of form should be referred to the matter, and vice versa, the account of matter should be referred to the form. So if my understanding is correct, I'm still confused how the isolated accounts of each correlate contains reference to the other correlate. Could you give me some illustrations and clarifications of how this is so in cases of both the general hylomorphism and the psychological hylomorphism? Now, this is my first question. Should I continue to state my second question?
Perhaps not, because that's quite an engaging question, which I hadn't really asked myself that clearly. And I think it's a very good question, because what is new for me is not the question of the correlation. That's a question I've been thinking about quite a bit. It's putting this together with the other question, whether there's a different level of specificity in which the hylomorphic theory of the soul has to say or to reference the corresponding body. But to start, yes, an example is Aristotle's definition of the soul in the Anima 2.1. So that's the essence of the living body. It's the form according to the definition of the living body. That's a general characterization of the form. Now, when you say, and now you can go into more specific levels of generality. Aristotle says, for example, I think that's in Metaphysics Zeta 11, that if you define a thing that has perception, then you have to say something about matter. Because perception involves matter in some way or other. So if you say perception, which is a part of the soul, the capacity of perception, then you would have to say, oh, that's defined as the capacity of taking on the form of the object, of the external object, without the matter, which I think just means without the external object, just the quality. Then you have a reference to matter. And that's the matter of the object, for example. But it might also be the quality present in the perceiver that is not itself material. Qualities are immaterial, but they presuppose a material implementation. And Aristotle's zoology offers proofs and accounts for what sort of material structure needs to be in place so that animals are able to perceive.
Yeah, I quite agree with your examples, but this sort of examples are not some sort of, I mean, I take the accounts as definition. So seems like the examples you just gave to me are not examples of the definition of the form should be referred to some accounts of matter. I mean,
so I'm not sure I understand. I think I hoped that my examples would be examples for definitions. So perception is defined as the capacity of taking on the blah, blah, blah. So that seems to be a definition.
Okay, I think the difference between your understanding and my understanding is how do we understand form as, I mean, soul as a form of the animal. Probably is your interpretation of the soul as episodic existence of animal, living animal. So I think this would naturally lead to my second question. My second question is actually related with your interpretation of the soul of the animal as is coming into episodic existence in the living body. So I raised this question because I think that the soul should be a sort of unity that actualizes the living body to be and living actualizes the body to be a living animal. So do you also think that the soul is a unity? If you do think so, how does your interpretation of Aristotle's theory of soul accommodate the unity of animal soul? This is my second question. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. And stay in the line because I might have a question for you. Okay, so just by way of clarification, before I come to the unity bit. So when I speak about the episodic existence of the soul, I don't want to say, and I hope to have excluded, that I don't want to say that the soul just has episodic existence. No, the animal is defined by its capacity of perception, and that is something that is true of it, the possession of that capacity, essentially. So it cannot be without that capacity. So what and as such, it is the principle of the unity of the body. Because the body is, as it were, the animal body is built around that function. That is what animals do, they perceive most essentially as animals. And so our organisms are implementations of that function, if you want to put it that way. What I wanted to say with the episodic existence is that the actuality of the soul is not just the life of the animal, it is the exercise of the psychic function of perception. And that has results, like, for example, our awareness of external things. And these results are the achievements of our bodies. This is what our bodies do, they bring about. And that is, the result is the actuality of the capacity that defines the body and makes it a unity. So that is the basic. So the episodic existence of the soul is just the episodic existence of the soul in the sense of the exercise of the vital functions. And that exercise I'm claiming is doing causal work. So by thinking that soul as episodic existence, you're not talking about soul as the first actuality, but talking about soul as the second actuality. Exactly. Okay, thank you. Exactly. And thanks for your questions. Thank you.
Okay, next one, Zheng Zhonghua, I think.
Hi, thanks, Professor Crecilius. And I think it's very exciting talk because I've read many of your papers when doing my graduate thesis just this semester. So I'm very happy to hear you in person. So my question, I have two questions, and my first question, following Professor Liu Wei's, is quite general, and it seems to me that using Aristotle's De Anima as a inquiry into the soul is about how the soul performs the explanatory functions of phenomena of life. But I think this may go against many traditional interpretation of the anima, because it's like, first, it's indeed an inquiry into the soul, but it's about the perhaps essence of the soul or the principle of this discipline. So, but you think that, and as you argue in your talk, that you exclude Dharma to the first chapter of book 2 of the job of giving a definition of the soul, but it's like job description. So my question goes like this: is the anima really performing a job that goes devoted to explore the explanatory functions of the soul, of the phenomena of life? Because And another quite general question lying behind this is, how do you view the connection between the anima and say the motu animalium and the power mater halia? Because I think the traditional view is that, and as so you argued in your article contributed to the Symposium Aristotelicum devoted to the motu, that the anima is about the principles of the soul, and the motu is like the application of these principles. But according to your interpretation today, it seems to me that the anima devotes to perhaps the application, I mean, to the episodes of mental life level. So, and this is my first question. I think it's time for me to pause.
Yes, okay. Well, thank you very much. This is both very kind and very good questions, and questions that are very important to my project. So I think I would like to stick with my idea of the anima being devoted to the definition, the finding of the definition. It results in definitions of the first principle of the science of living things quite generally. And that the Parva Naturalia, and I think that the motu animalium is just part of the Parva Naturalia, the project of the Parva Naturalia. Or very, very similar to it. And there's, I think, in the system of Aristotle's writings, there is no other place for it than in the sequence of writings called Parva Naturalia. But it is also cognate to the another treatise devoted to the efficient cause. The soul is an efficient cause, and that is the generation of animals. That these other writings apply that principle. But however, so I want to stick to that. Now, the question is, does the anima also engage in the explanation, in the application? And that's not an easy question, because you find passages that might suggest something like that. And for example, when he speaks about perception and the anima, and I do not think that this is necessarily the case, but one would have to look very carefully at what he says in the particular passages. For example, when he speaks about the principle of locomotion in the Anima 3, 9-11, he is really talking about episodes. When does, but actually the way that the problem is, or the question is framed, is a question of what part of the soul is it that is the first principle of that. So that is the principle of that. So I think the boundaries are not always very clearly distinguishable, but grosso modo, on the face of it, and as far as the architecture of Aristotle's science of living things is concerned, we have the idea that the anima gives us the structuring principle of the whole enterprise. And then we have works that presuppose the anima, and this is what the beginning of the De Sensu explicitly says. That is, I think, the basic picture, and I find it confirmed. Having said that, however, I also think that you only, in the Aristotelian way of thinking about science and scientific explanation, you only really know what the principle is if you see what work it does in the actual explanations. So you really only know what the soul is if you see what how it figures in explanations of the phenomena of the mental. An example is quite towards the beginning of the second book of the Parts of Animals. Since perception is the presence of qualities, what must a body be like, such as to be capable of receiving those? Oh, it must blah, blah, blah. And then therefore it must have a heart, and it must have blood, and so on. So then you see that the definition of the soul, in this instance, the perceptual soul, is actually a premise in an explanatory syllogism by way of hypothetical necessity that says you cannot implement a body with such a function in the world without these and that particular bodily attributes. Therefore, such a body exists because we know we have this as a first principle. So, but the question really is that you raise is a very tricky one, because where exactly do we have to draw the boundary? And so Aristotle, I think, is not very interested in these meta questions. And he's happy to say, for example, as he does in De Sensu, that, oh, we've already spoken about the sense of hearing. We don't need to repeat this here. And that seems to be something that sort of violates this principle of the division of labor that we are talking about. But actually, I don't think it does. It's okay. The point is that the road to the principles, which you want to find in the De Anima, as Plato says, the road to the principle is not the same and ought not to be the same as the deduction from the principles. And so even if he has many things to say that you can apply to episodes of perception in the De Anima, I am not sure that this is, and actually I'm doubtful whether this is a scientific explanation of perception. Indeed, I think his scientific explanation of perception is much more specific than what he gives us in the De Anima. We only don't know exactly. I mean, maybe we are missing out on something, but the story that I've been telling you about the localized soul as being an important part in the explanation of episodes of perception, that's a story for which I have textual evidence. I have it in the De Sensu, I have it in the De Anima. But Aristotle doesn't present it as an account. He says it by the way. So, so I think I'm not sure whether we actually have his scientific account of episodes of perception, his official account of episodes. I'm just offering you a story which is well, based and tested in the text, but not sure that this is his official account. So maybe there's an overlap then, and between the explanation of the application of the principle and the finding of the principle. And sometimes the De Anima looks like that, as if there is a certain interest in going beyond just defining what the soul is. Another example is, we have, nous has been defined in the Anima to 3, 4, and 5, and then in chapter 6, he goes on and he says, oh, actually what we just talked about, that is the basis for another kind of thought, namely propositional thought. And then he says something about nous being responsible for the unity of the proposition and so on. And that looks like applying the principle defined in the previous chapters and somehow going halfway towards the application. And I really like your question, because that is something that I'm puzzled about. So there are elements of application in the De Anima, there is no doubt. But I still want to think that you can, grosso modo, say, yeah, the De Anima gives you the structuring principle, that's the highest principle, the most abstract thing that you can say about the soul. And the idea is other writings apply this principle, even though there are some applications to be found even in the De Anima. And you can see this in his discussion of the moving principle. In chapter 10 of the third book, he says, well, now we talk about the body responsible for the transmission of qualitative change into mechanical change. And that's something that we are not supposed to talk about in the here. We have to talk about this in the works common to body and soul. So thank you very much. I could go on talking about this, but I feel that I already spoke too much.
Thank you. It's very illuminating. But can I have just very little quick up? So my question can go beyond the question of division of the labor of the different books of Aristotle. But is it possible that for you to show more sympathy on the view that to give an account of the soul, or to to give an account of the essence or what is of the soul, and should include the explanations or accounts of the episode of its function or its activities or that. It's just I just probably have in my mind, but I'm not sure.
Well, now I think I mean, in a way, yes, and in a way, clearly, no. That's my answer. So the way that Aristotelian sciences work, and I assume that Aristotle thinks of the science of living things as one of his sciences. It's important that the principle, is the first starting point, and the unmediated sort of starting point from which you start deriving theorems about the domain in question. And that ought to be an object of definition. So you can define the principle. And if you want to derive all the necessary and universal properties that hold of the domain, insofar as it is a member, insofar as the domain is what it is, for example, you want to define the first principle of the science of living things, that's the soul. And what you need the soul for is as the first principle for the explanation of the phenomena of living things, insofar as they're relevant for the science. And these are all the universal and necessary attributes that living things have insofar as they are alive. And so the principle is the explanans, and the per se accidents, the necessary and universal attributes that living things possess insofar as their life, is the explanandum. That's what you want to derive with reference to the principle. Then you need to separate these two, because otherwise the one couldn't do the explanation of the other. So that is the part of my answer that disagrees with your suggestion. Now here comes the part in which I agree with it. Of course, you only really know whether the principle has been correctly defined and what the principle actually really is, you only see when you see what it does in the explanation of the per se attributes of living things. And so that's my answer. It's important that they need to be conceptually separable from each other, because otherwise you couldn't derive the one from the other.
Thank you. It helps.
Okay, next one, Wang Wei.
Hi, Klaus. It's good to see you again.
It's very good to see you. Hi.
Yes. I'm very sympathetic to your view, and especially your sort of your argument against the conceptual theory in favor of the causally efficacious, more functioning localization theory of the soul. So my question, I guess, and I think it is supported by many passages in De Anima and De Motu Animalium and the Physics 8, for example. My question, I guess, is sort of the question I ask myself, and also, I guess, this might also be a question for Aristotle, is that I guess the advantage of having the localization theory is that you would be able to find a location for the soul, and then it is more sort of causally sound theory that you have a point from which to act and to have sort of interaction and so on and so forth. Whereas the conceptual theory is just to say that soul is a conceptual entity, it is nowhere to be located or whatever. But then it seems to me that for Aristotle, if we, for example, locate the soul in the center or locate the first mover of the universe at its periphery, then it seems to me that we still have to ask the question, what is it? And if we do not want to answer it by saying that it is just that point, or it is just the periphery or the topos, because for Aristotle, we also have the evidence to think that he thinks that topos is less real than what is in the topos, maybe. So the question is still, what is it? If it is sort of the qualitative actuality, then it seems to be the case that it's still less real than the thing that are surrounded by it or whatever. And also we have evidence, for example, in physics, metaphysics beta, when Aristotle talks about geometrical boundaries and the things that are bounded by geometric boundary, namely geometrical forces, seems to think that the latter are more robust than the former. So it might be a question for Aristotle himself. So if the advantage is only locating it, then if we strip the location, then what is it? Is it, if we strip the location, then it's still something conceptual, then what is the advantage? Except for saying that we do find a location of the action or interaction. So that's my question.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it very much. That's a very good question, and it's good to ask the question with relation to the fundamentals of Aristotle's physics. And I've been thinking about this a little bit myself. So to say that the soul is localized is just a Latin way of saying that it is somewhere. It is not to say, and one need to carefully distinguish, and you are indicating that we need to carefully distinguish being somewhere from having an Aristotelian topos, an Aristotelian location. Because a location, a topos, is something that is defined even with relation to a body, it's namely the boundaries of the body. But we are talking here about incorporeal, non-bodily things. And Aristotle himself draws that distinction. So Aristotle seems committed to the thesis that everything that is in the cosmos is somewhere. But that doesn't mean that everything has a topos, because only materially extended things have topoi. And so that's one thing. So that's why he engages in the search for where is the first unmoved mover located, which seems to us to be a funny question in many ways, but it follows with a lot of urgency from Aristotle's physics and really ontology. If there is anything at all, then it is going to be somewhere. Okay, so that's a distinction that Ben Morrison talks a little bit about towards the beginning of his dissertation, and recently Christian Pfeiffer spoke about this in his book on Aristotle's theory of bodies. So that's an important distinction. Localization of the soul is something that assigns a somewhere to the soul, but not a topos. But in order for the soul to be the fulcrum of animal locomotion, it needs to be locally distinct from the body, because it couldn't do mechanical work if it were not locally distinguishable. Okay, that's that. Then the question is, I mean, I didn't mean to say your other question about if we strip away the local properties. Now, the local properties, you are right, I emphasize them very much, because as trivial as they might seem, they really do the important work. It's a necessary condition for doing any causal interaction. And that's really the point. How can the hylomorphic soul do any work in nature? Well, it needs to have contact with natural things, and that requires it to be somewhere. But when we talk about the items that have this location or this place, this somewhere assigned to them, then we have to look at, what they substantially are. And in the case of the perceptual soul, I claim we are talking about qualities. Now, the perceptual soul doesn't occur separately from the vegetative soul, so things are much more complicated. But the perceptual soul as such is the receptivity, as a capacity, the receptivity of certain qualities that requires it itself to be a potential quality. And if it's actual, it's going to be an actual quality. And that's a physical item in Aristotle's physics, even if not a physical thing, but a property of physical things. Only that the particular feature of perceptual qualities is that they are located in the body, but they are not properties, or not primarily properties. So if I see you as I do now, then I see you, and you, or the qualitative image that I have of you, is not a property that I have. It's a property that you have, and it's in me. So that's the and that is, of course, the most important thing to be said about perception. And in the case of the unmoved mover, we have a different case, because that is really a living thing. That is a thinking event that does not have any extension, but some sort of, localization.
Okay. So because of the late start, we slightly extended the time for a few minutes. We still have two persons. So first one, I think Liu Zhe.
Hi, Klaus. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I enjoy your talk pretty much. I'm not specialized in Aristotle, but I find quite interesting, especially in your concrete theory, not abstract psychological hylomorphism. In this theory, you said the actuality of the soul is actually a kind of resulting achievement of the processes distinctive for the living animal body, right? And in this sense, the actuality of the actual presence of this soul, it means a perceptual quality. But the problem is, if we think about this perceptual quality in the science of hylomorphism, that means a kind of form. And you also said Aristotle is a kind of realist. And so this, I presume, this perceptual quality must be at the same time a kind of representation of objective form. So the problem is, how in this sense can we still account of the improvement of our perception, right? And the second, how can we account of hallucination and illusion? To all these things, we always have this kind of the actuality of the soul, but at the same time, it has nothing to do with the form of the object, right? So in this sense, the point is what Aristotle's concept of form means on the basis of your concrete theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that's a very good question, a very professional question also. Okay, so Aristotle is, roughly, because if you go into the details, then that's wrong, but roughly Aristotle is a naive realist in the modern framework of perception. So he thinks that that perception is a relation that is partly constituted by the perceiver and partly by the object. So it's only perception if the object is actually there, causing its own being perceived in the appropriate ways. So only that is perception. Now, when you have hallucination or dreams or whatever, then you are employing the very same system, but the relation is a different one. And so the problem is Aristotle is not as a disjunctivist, because he still speaks of perception occasionally. And disjunctivists would never do that. but in spirit, he is a naive realist, I think, because he thinks, he clearly thinks of perception as a relation in the way that I just indicated. And he thinks that this relation does not obtain in these deviant cases, or cases of awareness of presence of mental content that is not tied to an object that is externally there and causally affecting the perceiver. So then what are these guys? Okay, what is it that I'm dreaming when I have a dream of whatever? Then these guys are stored sensory stimuli that come to the fore. He calls them phantasmata, and they come to the fore again and are discriminated anew in the heart due to internal physiological processes, and sometimes due to our memory or associations, or willfully we can actually search them and bring them to the fore again. We can make ourselves remember things by a certain search process in which we can be more or less professional. So these phantasmata then are stored sensory stimuli. They come to the fore and then they bring about these qualities again. Now, what they are of, now that is a question that allows for various answers. It depends on the mental activity you are currently engaging in. So if I want to remember you, tomorrow I think about this talk and I think about your question. Oh, that was a particularly interesting question. What was the name, and so on. Then I will engage in the search and I will have you present, the image of you, or the stimulus of you will excite the awareness of you, the presence of you, and it will be an episode of remembering because it will be episodic about you. But that is not necessary. I can also have you mentally present to me without knowing that it's you, or without thinking about yesterday, tomorrow. And it really depends on what use, Aristotle says, the soul makes of these images. And so they can, but need not necessarily be the forms of external things. And that's the difference to perception, where they need to be the qualities of the external things. So that's my answer. I don't know whether I fully addressed your question.
Yeah, the single question left is improvement of perception. Even we perceive something, for instance, like in the darkness, we see something, but when we turn on the light, the same quality can change a little bit. It can be improved. So in this sense, how should we take account of the difference?
Yes, Aristotle doesn't talk about this to my knowledge, but he could easily, first of all, he would maximize out of the causal effects that the external objects have. Now, if we sort of think about the differences that are generated by T1 and T2, for example, light conditions, and makes me see more clearly an external object, then I think Aristotle would analyze that as a process that is reflexive. Like low-level perceivers couldn't engage in that process because they lack the cognitive capabilities of sort of bringing together and sort of both storing these T1, T2 images or impressions, and then engaging in some sort of reflection about this. And if you're talking about an automatized process that are, for example, so you have something that you have range shifting, for example, in perception. And I think that is something that Aristotle could easily explain as well. That's a subconscious process. That is just something that our organisms do. If we're exposed to a certain light conditions that are particularly bright, for example, then our eyes will adapt so as to maximize awareness of differences. And he would explain this with, I think, teleological reasons. This is what we do, our organisms do, because what we want to do, what our organisms sort of are geared, hardwired to do, is to maximize internal presence of differences. And so the body is subservient towards bringing this about within the boundaries of the capabilities of the body.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, our last questions, I think, Cao Qingyun.
Thank you. Hi, Klaus.
Hi, hello.
Hi, thank you very much for your amazing lecture. Actually, I agree with you with many points, but I have two questions. The first one is about the rational soul, or the episodes of thinking. Yes. I think your lecture, in your talk, you did not talk about this. So could you give a general description of the relationship between like rational soul to a living body?
Yes.
So yeah, that's the first one. And the second one is about the soul's episodic existence. My question is like this, or a little commentary. If you think soul comes into episodic existence in the living body, then let's consider this case. if we do not come into any like perceptual episodes, does that mean we don't possess the perceptive soul?
Yes.
So that sounds, your position sounds to me, as I understand, it's like to say that soul is a property or is an imagined property that come into being in a physical system. So it sounds very, very, very much like the position of imagined or regarding Aristotle's theory of soul. I mean, a theory of imagined. Yeah, so can you give more like clarification about the episodic existence?
Okay, well, thank you for your questions. Now, the latter question. So the episodic existence of the soul, I think, is just the episodic actuality of the soul. The animal is only an animal in virtue of possessing the soul. However, even when a dog sleeps, the dog will be a dog, but it will not do the kind of things that dogs typically do, namely bark around or whatever. But if a dog does what is typical for a dog, and it actually does that, namely perceiving in a certain way and living a dog life, and actually doing the things that dogs do, then the dog soul will be actualized. And that will have an episodic existence because in the first actuality, the dog is sleeping, but that doesn't mean that the soul is absent. Okay, so I was talking about the second actuality, and it's only in the second actuality that the soul can do episodic work. That on particular occasions, on particular moments of time, move the animal or perceive a sensory stimulus or something, or actually not perceive external things. Regarding the first question, well, that is, I really didn't speak about this at all, and you're very, very right to press me on that. So let me just say the following. The intellectual soul is not hylomorphic. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that it is not essentially of a body. So the things that I said about hylomorphism, 1 to 7, or psychological hylomorphism, 1 prime to 8 prime, or whatever the number was, these things do not hold of the intellectual soul, the intellect. However, but what does that say? Well, that says that the intellect is not essentially of the body. But that's, of course, compatible with the saying that we need bodily conditions for thinking, we need representational conditions of thinking, we need educational, linguistic, and you name it, all these things that we need to be able to do if we want to engage in what Aristotle calls thinking. And Aristotle has a very high-minded conception of thinking. Thinking is not just if I think of my grandmother or something, it is when I'm thinking essences. And very few people can do this successfully, he thinks. And that's thinking, and that's what he's talking about. And if I think about my mother in some intellectual kind of way, then that is, if it's not just a mere imagination, then that is something that I can do because I have the capacity of grasping essences. So there, I have views about this, and I think that Aristotle thinks basically about the human body as being teleologically geared towards thinking. This shows in our upright posture, this shows in many other things, that we have hands and so on. But he does not think that this is a hylomorphic relation. So it's not the case that you cannot have an intellect without a body. That is not the case. You can have an intellect without the body, and that really makes it not hylomorphic. And then the problem is, how can that thing be causally efficacious? How can I say that my mind prompted me, that my thought prompted me to do this or that? And that's a story I think Aristotle wants to answer in the Anima 3, 9 to 11 and in the De Motu Animalium, and he thinks it's via perception. So the physical apparatus, the moving apparatus, legs, arms, they need to be put to work. And that it's not enough to say, oh, I'm thinking of, the essence of something. It needs to be something that is causally efficacious in such a way as to bring about heatings and chillings, and the sinews need to do their work and so on. And a mere thought couldn't do that. It needs to be the mental representation of that thought. It needs to be something that I engage in, something that is important to me also from an emotional point of view. If it's not, I will not move. And the emotion brings about the contact with the body, because emotions are bodily for Aristotle. So that's basically the answer to it. So the body is tremendously important in our rational actions, but it's not an essential fact about rationality as such that it be embodied. And that is different from perception. Perception is essentially of a body.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question, and good to see you.
Thank you.
So, okay, we are already running out of time.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I'd like
Too
to
long.
thank everyone for attending the lecture and sharing your ideas today. So first of all, let's thank Klaus again for your wonderful lectures and answers.
Thank you so much. And thank you. I really enjoyed that. It's extremely kind.
Thank you so much.
And it's very good to see all of you in spite of the distance. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that.
So thank you, everyone. Have a nice weekend.